Hi everyone, back again for our last webinar. I'm just going to wait for another minute or so to let people enter, and then we will get going on today's webinar, all about Australia and New Zealand universities. Okay, let's go. Let's get going. So a warm welcome to you all. It's really lovely to see you today. I don't know if for some of you, you may have tuned into our other webinars. This is the final one in this series of university webinars. And today, Sarah will be talking about Australia and New Zealand. But first of all, just a little bit of background. So I'm Tess Wilkinson. I'm in the UK where it's foggy and grey, so I think talking about Australia and New Zealand is a wonderful thing to do today for us. And Henley and Partners Education was launched 2 months ago in response to the increasing demands from clients for expert and impartial advice on the best global education options for them and their children. One of the many benefits of investment migration is enhanced access to premium global education. And in unpredictable times, most of our clients are looking to secure world-class education for their children in top schools and universities that provide a stable, safe and nurturing environment. The past 2 years have been enormously disrupted due to the pandemic, and whilst international education was still operating and the provision of online education for students put in place, the quality has varied greatly, and the result is that many parents are now looking for other solutions to future-proof their children's education. Many of our clients are rightly confused as to who to turn to for advice regarding education and which countries they should go to so their children can access great education that will equip them for the future. By providing extensive sector-specific expertise through our global networks and our highly experienced consultants, we work hand in hand with our families to ensure that their child is placed in a school or university which matches their talents, aspirations, and academic ability. And the good news is that many countries that host residence and citizenship by investment programs, such as the UK, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and numerous European countries, are home to the world's best educational institutions. And with so many options, Henley & Partners Education is here to help you make one of life's most important and difficult decisions, actually, choosing the right education for your child. And with that in mind, we're delighted to welcome you to the last of our webinar series on global universities. And today, Sarah is going to share her expertise on the options available in the countries they specialise in. One of the most popular and desired locations for higher education is Australia and New Zealand. So we're going to find out all about that today. So Sarah's been advising students on university options in Australia and New Zealand for almost 20 years. Her international education career began in New Zealand, where she ran the international student admissions team at Victoria University of Wellington. She's since worked exclusively in student counselling, helping students successfully apply to and enrol at their chosen universities in Australia and New Zealand. Sarah works closely with the teams at Australia and New Zealand's top universities, including the University of Melbourne, University of Sydney, and the University of Auckland, among others, aiming to provide great application outcomes for students. Sarah is passionate about helping all students find the university and the course that best fits their profile and their future aspirations, and which offers them the opportunity to achieve to their fullest potential. So now, over to you, Sarah. Let's hear all about these universities, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tess. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm not sure where you're joining us from in the world, but thank you very much for your time. So as Tess said, I am a university advisor for Australia and New Zealand. And what I would really like to do in the presentation today is really introduce these two countries to you as potential university destinations for yourselves, for your families, for your children. Now, what I'm going to aim to do is run over some of the key points of difference to be aware of in both these systems. I know that you've already heard from consultants who work with American universities, with UK universities, with European universities. So just want to introduce this as an option. You know, how is it different to some of the other systems that you've looked at? I'm also going to cover a few of the practicalities about the application process. Now, obviously, by its nature, this will be quite a general introduction to Australian and New Zealand higher education, but I'm really, really happy to take questions at the end of the session. So if something comes up that I haven't covered over these slides, please do make a note and ask me at the end of the presentation. Okay, so just to kick off really, I guess, and to give an overview of these systems. As Tess said, Australia and New Zealand are enormously popular destinations, particularly for higher education for international students. Australia is actually currently the third most popular university destination for international students in the English-speaking world, and has been, so sorry, that's behind the US and the UK, and it has been for quite some time. So when I talk today, you'll notice that I'm sort of talking about Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, these countries are very, very different, and I'm very happy to kind of get into the nuances of how they are different in terms of destinations later on. But the reason that I'm grouping them together is because their education systems are very, very similar. Okay, so from the point of view of choosing universities, talking about the university system, the student experience, they really are a very similar proposition, which is why I'm sort of talking about both at the same time. So in terms of the scale of what you're looking at in Australia and New Zealand has just 8 universities, all of which are government institutions, public institutions. Australia has over 40. The vast majority of those are government universities, but Australia is also home to a few private universities, as well as the campuses of 2 international universities as well. For example, Carnegie Mellon University from the US has a campus in South Australia, in Adelaide. So that's the sort of the range, if you like, of the university offering. Now, in terms of how these universities would present, they're not all the same at all. They range very much from your large, comprehensive universities, such as the University of Sydney, the University of Melbourne, the University of Queensland, many of which you guys may already have heard of, be familiar with, to much smaller or much more subject specialist institutions. For example, James Cook University in Northern Queensland is recognised as one of the world's strongest institutions for the subject of marine biology, tropical ecology. So you really have pockets of individual subject excellence at smaller universities, not just at these larger, sort of more well-known institutions. The standards of teaching, of reputation in both of these countries are very, very high, consistently so. So I actually have a slide to show you guys about international university rankings, but there are currently 7 Australian universities and 1 New Zealand university ranked amongst the top 100 institutions in the world. Now, there I'm referring to overall institution rankings, but just going back to that previous point, many of the Australian and New Zealand universities would be ranked even higher than that for individual subject disciplines. We'll get on to kind of how those 2 types of ranking might sort of play out for an individual student choice slightly later on. The other thing I think to sort of set the scene, as it were, is that both Australia and New Zealand use education systems that are based on the UK model. So anyone who is familiar with the UK education system that is essentially the start point when you look at Australian and New Zealand universities. So they do differ from them slightly in terms of their structure and content of their degrees, but really what you're looking at is a university system where students enter at 18. So after they've completed the equivalent of A-levels or the International Baccalaureate and so forth, most degrees are 3 years long, as they would be in the UK. Some professional, some specialist degrees are longer. And the way that universities teach students is very similar to the UK as well. So you're looking at lectures, seminars, tutorials, with clinical work, field work, as and when needed, depending on the subject being studied. So all of those sort of like basic factors are very, very similar to what you would expect to see in the UK. Now, Australia and New Zealand, however, I think have some of the strongest safeguarding measures around the quality of their provision of international education. So both countries actually have very, very strong sort of regulatory frameworks set out in law designed to ensure the well-being, the pastoral well-being of international students, but also the quality of their educational experience. So this is a very, very sort of familiar system. It will seem a very familiar system for many of you. It's a very safe system, and it's very, very regulated. So it's very transparent and sort of easy, hopefully, to sort of see exactly what is available for students and who is responsible for delivering that to the standard that you would all expect as families. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I was going to sort of pull up some examples of the international rankings. Now, certainly, I would say that rankings can be a very helpful way of trying to sort of get an idea of how the institutions in one country might benchmark against institutions in another country that you may be considering as a destination. So I just wanted to sort of flash up some facts and figures here in front of you. So the two ranking systems that I've referred to on the first 2 points that you can see here, these are what I would consider to be the main international rankings. So this is what we would usually refer to. So one is run by QS and the other by the Times Higher Education. Now, both of these rankings are published on an annual basis and certainly can be helpful in terms of getting an idea of how these universities compare, you know, what sort of American, UK, European universities they might sit next to or near to on these international barometers. Now, you'll see that a number of the same names, same university names appear in both rankings. Now, these are essentially for Australia, what we call the Group of 8. Now, the Group of 8 is an unofficial ranking, if you like, but it is equivalent to the UK Russell Group universities or the US Ivy League. And the members of the Group of 8 are sort of really the universities you can see listed on that top point. So the ANU in Canberra, the University of Melbourne, the University of Sydney, UNSW Sydney, the University of Queensland, Monash University, the University of Western Australia, and the University of Adelaide. You can see the University of Auckland appearing there. Auckland is generally regarded as New Zealand's top ranking university. It is closely followed by the University of Otago, which I did just want to sort of throw in as a name. That's a fantastic option for students, particularly undergraduate students, in my opinion. When we look at rankings, though, one thing I did really want to sort of highlight is that I think it's extremely important for students to not just look at these overall rankings and actually to take some time to dig into individual academic subject rankings, because really there is a balance to be struck there, in my opinion. So, you know, you may find, for example, that if somebody wants to study medicine, for example, you know, so you may see that the University of Melbourne is ranked number 33 in the world overall, but for the study of medicine, it's much higher. It's in the world's top 10. So, you know, it's really worth kind of looking at both of those rankings. Again, both the Times Higher Education and QS do publish annual subject-specific rankings, and I would absolutely encourage you guys to take a look at those, really to get an idea of where these universities sit in both the overall sense and for the individual discipline that you are considering for your child. Now, the last point I wanted to make on this is that the other way to really get a sense of how a university is perceived internationally, so both by employers and by its peers in the international university sort of sphere, is to look at its partnerships, to look at its affiliations. So you will see, for example, that Monash University has a very close alliance with Warwick University here in the UK, and they are ranked at very similar levels internationally. The University of Otago in New Zealand has a close alliance with Durham University here in the UK. Again, there's a lot of sort of synergies between those institutions. So that's really the other way, I think, that you can get a sense of how these universities are perceived. Okay, so having sort of introduced, hopefully, some of the sort of points of similarity, particularly to university systems in the UK, I did just want to highlight a few key points of difference that I think are really, really important for anyone to be aware of if they're looking at these countries as potential undergraduate destinations. Now, the first key point of difference is that the structure of a general degree in Australia and New Zealand is much broader, much more flexible than it tends to be in the UK, though not as broad as the US. So if we're thinking about these particular destinations on a range, on a scale, Australia and New Zealand would sit pretty firmly in the middle of the UK on the one end and the US on the other. So the UK, our degrees, I'm also based in the UK, the degrees here tend to be very narrow in terms of their subject focus. So students will generally be studying one thing for the duration of their bachelor's degree. In the US, you don't even select your major until you might be in even the third year of a 4-year degree. So your first 2 years in the US are going to be very, very broad. You could be studying all sorts of different things. Now, Australia and New Zealand will ask students to commit to a major. So that's your specialist subject. That's what's going to be written on your degree certificate when you graduate. You must commit to that from your first year of studies. So you're going to be studying your specialist subject from the get-go. However, around that, you still have the opportunity to take elective subjects. So you can take subjects that interest you, that you think are going to be helpful for your future career aspirations, that play to your academic strengths, whatever that is. But you can take those electives around the major. So I think it's a really, really sort of positive feature of Australian and New Zealand higher education, in the sense that you have that focus from year one. You are specializing in a particular subject, but you still have the flexibility and you still have that breadth. You're allowed to take subjects from outside of your major. So as a general rule, I would say that around 2/3 of somebody's total study time is going to be taken up by courses from their major. So that allows around 1/3 of people's study time throughout the degree for them to explore elective courses. Now, in terms of what someone can study in Australia and New Zealand, what subjects can they study? I think it's important to be aware that both of these countries offer professional degrees at undergraduate level. So that is more similar to the UK than it is to the US, where many things are graduate. But Australia and New Zealand will also offer this as graduate entry as well. Okay, so let's look at those two things. So you can train as, for example, a doctor, a dentist, a teacher, an engineer, a lawyer, either directly from school. So you apply for a bachelor's of law, bachelor of medicine, bachelor of surgery, whatever your chosen sort of profession is, you can do that directly after finishing school. Or you can do a general degree and then apply for example, the Doctor of Medicine, so graduate entry medicine. So either of those routes are available to students in Australia and New Zealand. So again, very, very flexible. I think, in terms of when somebody makes those career choices, there's still an option there for them to get to that end goal that they're hoping to reach. In terms of how the student experience might differ compared to, for example, the UK or the US, I think that one of the really defining features of Australian and New Zealand university education is that they really place a lot of emphasis on experiential learning. So they're very keen on learning by doing. That means that, you're really going to have a lot of practical placement experience. You're going to have, for example, internships offered. You're going to have field work offered. You know, any science student is going to be really encouraged to get into the labs, into, you know, and do a lot of practical work. If, for example, someone is studying law, they may find themselves in, you know, offering their expertise in a legal aid clinic that's affiliated to the university. So lots and lots of emphasis on really kind of taking these skills and these knowledge that they're giving to the students and encouraging them to use them in the real world, actually whilst they're still a student. So, you know, really kind of focusing on allowing them to hit the ground running when they graduate and they begin looking for their first job. Okay, now I've just got a couple of slides here just to sort of illustrate, I guess, what we're talking about in terms of the range of universities available. You'll see very much that Australia's universities are concentrated around the coastal areas, just as its population is. So obviously the scale of Australia is quite vast. So you will have, you know, a flight from Sydney on the east coast over to Perth on the west. That's a 5-hour flight. So I think for any of us based here in Europe, you know, these distances are quite something to get your head around. But yes, so you'll see though that there are concentrations of universities in all of the major cities of Australia, and also many in the smaller towns as well, depending on what a student is looking for in terms of their more general environment or location. The same map for New Zealand. So as discussed earlier, New Zealand just has 8 universities. New Zealand is much smaller. New Zealand, actually, geographically speaking, is about the same size as the UK. However, the population stats are very different. I believe that here in the UK, we're currently on over 60 million people. New Zealand hasn't quite hit 5 million just yet. So there is a lot of space available to students, but some really excellent universities, as again, dotted throughout the country in different locations, as you can see here. Okay. So I wanted to really come on to a couple of practicalities. So normally when a student or when a family come to me initially to ask about studying in Australia or New Zealand, many people are not that familiar with individual institutions, and actually many people would come more from the perspective of, I would like to study medicine, or I would like to study international business, you know. So when you start from that point, how do you actually go about this process? How do you start selecting which of these universities is going to be right for you? So the first thing I would say is, if a student is aiming to study what I would term a specialist course, such as medicine or vet science or music, fine art, you know, some of these courses, essentially your choice of university destination is in part going to be determined by where that course is offered. Not all universities teach all courses. So you'll find, for example, that if you want to do medicine, there are fewer universities that teach that course compared to, for example, international business, which pretty much all universities will offer. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. It's particularly true if you're looking at New Zealand as a destination. Again, only 8 universities. So there are only 2 universities in New Zealand, for example, that teach medicine. There's only 1 university that teaches vet science. So if you're looking at New Zealand in particular, this sort of, you know, the consideration of where the course is available is particularly sort of acute. However, if we look at it as someone who wants to study something that's much more widely available, such as business, I've just highlighted here a few of the factors that could come into play when you are considering, you know, how to make that short list of universities that you decide are the best options to apply for. One of the key ones that I would always really stress is what subjects, what actual classes does that university offer? So you've got, say, international business as your major, you know that's what you want to do as your specialist subject, but what do you want the option of studying around that? So it's important to look and make sure that what you're interested in is going to be available at that particular university. Entry requirements is another factor that needs to be looked at. So how do a student's predicted grades, their academic history, measure up to the standards that are required for that subject, for that particular degree at that university? Subject prerequisites as well. You will see in Australia in particular that they can be quite specific about what subjects they expect a student to have studied to their school leaving qualification. So for A-levels or IB, for example. So that can kind of come into play. What are the opportunities within a degree? You know, does somebody want the opportunity of doing lots of field work? What are the professional or clinical placements involved? Do they want the opportunity to go on international exchange, for example? If someone was doing international business, they might want to maintain the study of a language. How widely is that available? So those are some of the other things that will come in. Subject rankings, I think we've already covered those, but the next two factors as well, costs, and then allied to that, scholarships. So costs, each university in Australia and New Zealand for international candidates will set their own tuition fees. So you will see quite different costs involved for the same degree. So say the Bachelor of Commerce will cost a different amount at the University of Melbourne compared to say the University of Queensland. So that's something else to sort of put into the mix. And then scholarships. I am absolutely delighted to say that our universities, our university partners are increasingly offering undergraduate scholarships for academically talented candidates. So certainly that may be something that you want to take into consideration if someone is tracking particularly strongly in their school leaving qualification. Okay. So moving on to the practicalities of the application process. Australian and New Zealand universities start teaching in late February each year, not in September. So February is semester 1 in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's when the majority of undergraduate students would start their programs. There are, however, alternative intake dates at lots of our universities. July is a very, very common one. So semester 2, a lot of courses can be started in semester 2, but there are also some slightly more kind of individual starts. So for example, UNSW Sydney, which is a very strong university, member of the group of 8, they have a September intake that students can consider as well. So there can be individual options here, which again, I'm very happy to advise on further. Applications are made during a student's final year of school study, so the calendar year before they want to start their degree in Australia and New Zealand. We normally find that because our intake date is that much later than the Northern Hemisphere, obviously, so you're going from September through to the following February, normally our application deadlines are slightly later than you will see, for example, certainly for the UK and definitely for the US, later than the US. Most assessments are going to be made on the basis of school leaving qualifications, so IB, A-levels or the equivalent. There are some degrees that have additional requirements. They would usually be clinical programs like medicine or a performance-based degree such as music or fine art. So again, if that's what a student is interested in doing, I would work that into timelines from very early on in the process so everybody knew exactly what requirement had to be met at what stage, what timing. Now, in terms of when to apply, so if somebody is an international student in Australia and New Zealand, so an international student in these countries is anybody who is not an Australian or New Zealand citizen or permanent resident. So that's the only definition of domestic or local students in Australia and New Zealand. Everybody else, every other passport in the world means that you will be an international student. Now, as an international student, you can apply before you complete your school qualification and go for a conditional offer of place. So that would work in a very similar way to, say, a UCAS offer here in the UK. So your place would be contingent on you achieving certain grades or scores in your final exams. Now, I would really strongly recommend students go for that option if they are also applying to universities in other countries. In terms of balancing different application systems and timeframes, it's really important that conditional offers are in place so that you don't find that the timelines and the deadlines of one system sort of compete with another. So I would always recommend going for a conditional offer as an international student. It is, however, possible to wait until you've completed your school qualification and then apply if you're not going for a clinical program like medicine. So the immediate caveat put on that. In terms of timelines, though, I would really prefer to advise on individual cases. So please do feel free to contact me to get some sort of specific advice for the subject that you're considering doing. And applications from international students are made directly to the university of choice. Okay, now I did just want to touch on this sort of issue of domestic students versus international students in Australia and New Zealand. I think there are likely to be some questions, as I understand it, around this. So I just wanted to cover some basic questions. In Australia and New Zealand, your student status, so whether you're domestic or international, is determined solely by your citizenship. So there is no residency requirement to qualify as a domestic student in either of these countries. Now, Australia and New Zealand have slightly different policies on this. So if you hold Australian citizenship or permanent residency, you are going to be classed as a domestic candidate in both Australia and New Zealand. If, however, you hold New Zealand citizenship, you're going to be domestic in both countries. But if you hold New Zealand permanent residency, you are not considered domestic in Australia. So that's a rule change that came in around 3-4 years ago, but very important to be aware of that. So only New Zealand citizens are considered to be domestic students in Australia. Now, what does it mean if somebody holds domestic status in Australia and New Zealand? So first of all, it means that they don't require a student visa to study. It means that they're going to be eligible to pay domestic tuition fees and potentially would be able to apply for a student loan, a government loan from the Australian or New Zealand authorities. They also have the option of studying part-time if they want to. So those are sort of the 4, I guess, key sort of statuses. However, I think in terms of looking at this, there are a few other factors or considerations to take into account. So number 1, accessibility. So I'm often asked whether it is easier or more straightforward to get a place at an Australian or New Zealand university if you are applying as a local student versus applying as an international. And I think that the really not very straightforward answer to that question is not always. So you will find that in the case of clinical programs like medicine, veterinary science, there certainly are quota numbers for domestic students and quota numbers for internationals. The international quota is always lower than it is for domestics, for example, for something like medicine. So certainly it's easier in the sense that you are going for a greater pool of places. You're competing for a greater pool of places. However, you may find that the competition for those places is even higher amongst domestic students than it is amongst internationals. So I think sort of the number of places available, but versus the ferocity of the competition to get them, that's a consideration. And again, that will differ depending on the course being applied for. Certainly, however, affordability, as you can see from the slide to the left-hand side of the screen, certainly is far more affordable to study in Australia or New Zealand if you hold domestic status, because you will be eligible to pay domestic tuition fees rather than international fees. And then application considerations, I've just put that on because one thing that really does kind of come into play if you are applying if you hold domestic student status, is that if you apply, for example, offshore, you may find that the actual timelines involved with the applications don't really play with the timelines, for example, if you're also applying to study in the UK. So, for example, if an Australian citizen was applying for an Australian university to start in February 2024, the application cycle for that intake for domestic students doesn't even open until August 2023. So that student cannot apply for a conditional offer of place. So in terms of juggling timeframes and so forth, that can be the other complication to be aware of in terms of different student statuses. Now, I'm aware I probably only really scratched the surface of this topic. And again, I'm really happy to take questions on this afterward if you have something that I haven't addressed here. Okay, so I think that's the end of my sort of general overview, my general presentation, but I'm really happy to take questions. So is there anything that anyone would like to ask?
Yes, and I forgot completely to mention at the beginning, there's a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screens. So if you want to write, if you have questions for Sarah, because she has touched on an awful lot of stuff that I've automatically got about 5 questions that have come up. But please just drop in questions in the Q&A and I can ask Sarah directly. Well, one of the things actually leading on from what you were saying about accessibility, Sarah, I've immediately thought, what is is there eligibility criteria other than grades? Because certainly in some countries, for instance, in Europe, in the public universities, if you haven't done certain subjects or got certain high school qualifications, you're not going to be eligible for the public universities. Is there some form of an equivalent in Australian or New Zealand universities?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Tess. In terms of accessibility, so again, this is slightly different for domestic versus an international, but students applying as international candidates must meet those academic requirements as set out by the individual institution for that particular course. Now, we often find that entry requirements for international students may seem slightly lower than they would for equivalently ranked universities in the UK or the US, for example. But the Australian and New Zealand universities are not very flexible on those requirements. So if somebody doesn't meet those grades, there's not an awful lot of room for maneuver, as it were. If a student doesn't meet the grades, though, then the universities will usually offer pathway programs. So there is a plan B, if you like, available. So somebody could, for example, do a foundation program. And those are taught by the universities themselves. So if you do, for example, the University of Queensland Foundation program, that is taught on the University of Queensland campus. You are a University of Queensland student from the get-go. But a foundation program could be anything from 6 months long. So if somebody has just missed their grades, for example, then they could do this short version of the foundation. Alternatively, you do have extended foundations as well. So maybe if somebody is qualifying with a school qualification that the Australian universities don't recognise as being equivalent to university entrance, then there would be a different version of foundation. But there is always a pathway available in terms of options for accessing these universities.
That's actually really interesting. It's fairly similar to some of the UK universities with the idea of the foundation year that can lead into a full degree. The other thing I was going to ask about was, and here I've completely forgotten, to do with, so for international students, it's always very important to, especially if they're coming from a long way away, where are they going to live? Do Australia and New Zealand university provide accommodation a bit like UK universities, halls and things like this, or do they have to find their own accommodation?
So as an international undergraduate student, that's a huge part of my role, to advise and to help with those, with securing suitable housing. I think, everybody would agree that it's such a critical thing to get right. As you said, particularly when somebody is traveling a very long way from home, you want to know exactly where they're going to be, and that they're going to be somewhere safe and reputable and comfortable. So all of our universities, yes, do offer their own accommodation, and we would really strongly recommend that actually a new first-year undergraduate student does go into some form of university accommodation, that they don't try to negotiate the private rental market in a city, unless of course they have family or friends located there, which is a very different thing. But if they're going independently, then I would always say that the best option is to go into university accommodation. Now, university accommodation can take quite a few different forms. So many of our older universities in Australia and New Zealand, so for example, University of Sydney, University of Melbourne, University of Otago, they offer a system called residential colleges. And this is really popular with a lot of international students, particularly those sort of leaving home for the first time. So a residential college is a sort of much smaller community within the wider student community. So you'd have all your meals in college. It's a fully catered option. So you'd have all your meals in college, but there's a really thriving student community. So there's a lot of, for example, social occasions that take place in college. There's a lot of sports competitions that take place in college, debating, so all sorts of kind of extracurricular things that sort of, and you have, there's several colleges at each university, and there's quite sort of like a friendly rivalry that goes on between them. So, that can be quite fun for a student to get involved with. But also from a parent's point of view, a residential college always has a live-in dean. So there is a live-in grown-up, as it were, who is there and in charge of maintaining, yes, sort of standards, discipline, whatever you would like to sort of say. So, again, those can be very, very popular options. Actually, we find that they tend to be really popular with students who've attended boarding schools in the UK, for example. I think partly because it's probably a very familiar system to them. And it sort of can be that very, very helpful sort of first step on leaving school and transitioning up to university. So yes, absolutely. So lots and lots of choice, but yeah, I think the residential college option is quite an interesting one to be aware of.
It really is, yeah, that's very interesting. And do these universities tend to have international exchanges? Are they 3-4 year, or can they be 4-year degrees if they have a year out in industry or with another university in a different country? Does that happen at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So Australia and New Zealand, I think, have actually always had very well-developed exchange networks all over the world, probably in part because they have never been able to, rely on the European Erasmus scheme, obviously because that is European. But yeah, so, they've developed their own exchange networks and actually have extensive networks all over the world. So a student could choose to go on exchange, anywhere from, South America, North America, Europe, the Middle East. There are university partnerships all over the globe. Certainly it would be encouraged if somebody was studying certain subjects that they take advantage of that, and that they, some degrees will actually have it as a mandatory requirement. But all students, regardless of the subject that they're studying, almost all, I should say, can apply to go on exchange if they want to sort of incorporate that type of experience into their overall student sort of time at university.
No, that's very interesting. And that sort of leads on nicely. So assuming you go through university, you have some, because you were talking about the experiential element of education in Australia and New Zealand. What is currently in place for graduates following their university experience? What do the two governments put out for students? Can they stay in the country to work? Do they have to leave? What are the opportunities in each country for graduates?
So Australia and New Zealand actually have some of the most generous post-study work visa schemes in the world. Again, very long-standing. They've been in place for many, many years. So for Australia, for example, if a student has completed a program that's at least 2 years in duration, so obviously any bachelor's degree would meet that particular requirement, then they are allowed to remain on a post-study work visa to gain their first job. I think the real strength of the Australian system, and actually it is the same rule in New Zealand, that your eligibility for the post-study work visa is not contingent on you having the offer of a job from an Australian or New Zealand employer. So you're actually eligible for the visa because you've completed the qualification at an Australian or New Zealand institution. So I think that's a real positive in the sense that you don't need to convince an employer to sort of back you through this process. You've earned it yourself by completing the program. It does mean that, obviously then from the employer's perspective as well, there's less of a risk because they are not immediately sponsoring a student for a work visa. Actually, a post-study work visa, again, it's very much all down to the individual, to the student. But certainly if somebody secured a role at a company and was working on their post-study work visa, so a post-study work visa can be anywhere between 2 and 4 years long. So if you're on your post-study work visa, sorry?
Depending on what, the length of post-study
the length
visa?
on the course, where you've studied, yes. So there are a couple of different factors that come into play there in terms of eligibility. But if you're then in a role and you and your employer are both very, very happy with your performance, you want to stay, then there is the option to look at further work visa sort of scenarios. So, you know, the post-study work visa is really intended to be sort of, you know, to cover that interim period, if you will, between graduating and then actually sort of, you know, sort of moving on to the next stage in your career. Yeah.
And actually, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but do many students who go through these two university systems, can the post-study work visa eventually lead to residency and potentially citizenship?
Potentially, yeah, absolutely. So the time that you spend in Australia and New Zealand on a student visa does not count towards a future residency requirement. So the time spent on a student visa does not count. However, as soon as you move on to a different kind of visa as a graduate, then certainly that time does count towards a future application for a more permanent visa, yes.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, and my last question, and I think we wrapped up there, is how competitive is the entry for these universities? Because we sort of touched on it, but you know, if we're thinking about some of the Ivy Leagues and the Russell Group universities, which their acceptance rate at the moment is sort of between 5 and 6 and 7% for some universities. What's the landscape like in Australia and New Zealand in that respect?
So I think that the actual the entry requirements for Australian and New Zealand universities, they are slightly less terrifying than you will see for universities in the US and the UK, certainly at the moment. So, you know, this does very much depend on the course, but if we're talking about a general course, so if we're talking about, you know, a Bachelor of Science, a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Commerce, for example, then certainly I think these universities are more accessible for students. The acceptance rates are higher. One thing for a student to know, though, which is very important, is that unlike the UK, when you enroll at an Australian or New Zealand university, your marks count towards your final degree classification from day one of year one. So much more like the States. So very important that when a student looks at these universities, you know, if they're sort of creeping in, they're just able to meet the entry requirements for a university, they need to feel pretty confident that actually when they enroll and they start studying, that they're going to, you know, find their feet pretty quickly. So unlike the UK, you don't get that year's grace to settle in. You know, it's all about, you know, how you go from the very start of your program. But yeah, certainly as an overall question, I do think that these universities are still more accessible. They are still easier to gain entry to than the top universities in the UK and the US. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So I'm just looking at these pictures saying, so unlike the UK, you can't spend your first year scuba diving and swimming. You do actually have to do some work.
No, exactly. I mean, I think, you know, a large number of the students that we work with certainly are really drawn to Australia and New Zealand because of this very sort of outdoor healthy lifestyle that both of them represent, you know. So, you know, lots of students who would much rather spend their spare time, you know, doing some of these incredible outdoor kind of based activities, whether it's, you know, paddle boarding on the Milford Sound, you know, the bottom picture of the beach, that's Rottnest Island off the coast of Perth, you know, so doing some of these things, you know, rather than, you know, some of the typical student sort of stereotypes that you'll see of, you know, just sitting in a pub in the UK for the afternoon, you know. So we send a lot of students who are very sporty and who really want that kind of, very healthy lifestyle, definitely as part of their undergraduate experience.
That's great. Sorry, I do have a last question, but before I ask it, maybe we can go to the last slide. So for people, if you're interested in contacting myself and Sarah, these are our contact details, because Henley and Partners Education always offer a free, no obligation call. If you have questions, if you want to talk to us and explore opportunities, then, you know, that's the way forward. So feel free to get in touch with us. But my last question was, how easy is it to get student visas? That's what I was asking. Because I've heard it can be quite complicated at the moment, or quite long.
So It's very, I guess, like any other visa process, right? It's about ticking all the boxes. It's about making sure all your documentation is in order, following the rules, you know, so all those things being equal, I would say that, you know, certainly I and my advising colleague, we have a very strong track record for student visa applications, but it is definitely something that you want to get right. Absolutely something to make sure everything is perfect when it is submitted in order to give yourself the best possible chance of success.
Yeah. Very important. And then finally, because we've been talking about timelines, and I know it's very different, but you know, we've been telling people if they want to go to US universities, they need to plan at least 18 months out. Yeah. What if you're given a month, sort of how many months, if people listening today have children or they are people who want to apply, how long out do they need to start thinking and potentially talking to you about this?
I mean, I would say, actually, you know, if you're looking at all of these different destinations, and if Australia and New Zealand is a possibility, then, you know, I'd start sort of like thinking about it and maybe contacting myself to get that sort of overview of when things need to happen. Yeah, but somewhere between 12 and 18 months out from the date of enrollment. So obviously the date of enrollment is that February point. So if, for example, if we have a student who's studying at school here in the UK, we'd really encourage them to contact us, you know, sort of before the summer holidays, or sorry, the beginning of their summer holidays of year 12, or the start of their final year of school. It's really, I think the key thing is just to make sure that, you know, when, particularly because so many people now do apply to different universities in different countries, rather, so they're balancing different application systems, just to make sure that you've got all the details that you need about each of those systems, so you can put it all in one place and see how they all relate to each other, make sure nothing's fighting against each other, you know. Yeah, so I'd say somewhere between 12 and 18 months would be our ideal. Okay, well, on that, thank you very much. So that was enlightening. I think Australia and New Zealand are certainly the university systems I know the least, so I've learned loads. I hope everybody else has too. And so that was our last webinar in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and these will be sent out to you. If you registered, you will be able to have the recordings and watch them back. But Sarah, thank you so much. It was lovely to have you today. Very well. And have a happy 1st of December, isn't it? It's 1st of December already. I can't believe it. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And we'll hear from you soon, I hope. Bye. Bye, Sarah. Thank you. Bye.